You will wear it. You will wear it because it is the one thing your mother left you that I have not yet been obliged to sell, and you will wear it because I require you to look like a lady tomorrow morning at 10:30 in the parish church of St. Chad's, and not like the burden you have been to me for these last 3 years. Have I made myself clear, Imogen?" The silence that followed was the silence of a young woman who had learned that to answer would cost her more than to be still. It lasted 6 seconds, broken only by the flat tick of an ormolu clock 2 hours slow. It was the 12th of April, 1817, 11 o'clock in the morning, in the small, dim drawing-room of Sterne House upon the Welsh border of Shropshire. The man who had spoken was Mr. Roderick Crouch, of no fixed estate. The young woman who did not answer him was Miss Imogen Sterne, of every right to that house, the village beyond it, the parish church upon the rise, and the small fading manor in which they stood. And of none of it, in the year 1817, in any practical sense whatever. Roderick Crouch found the silence to his satisfaction, turned his quizzing glass on its black ribbon, and walked out without closing the door behind him. The latch of the further door clicked. Imogen drew a single slow breath and lifted her clear sea-green eyes from the worn carpet to the small smoke stain above the empty grate. There are mistaken identity stories, there are forgotten name stories, and there are stories that begin, in the year of our Lord, 1817, with one cold sentence in a worn Shropshire drawing-room, and end, 6.5 months later, with a quiet plain grace at a Worcestershire dinner-table, for 2 old friends who did not live to see this evening, but who were at the table all the same. Miss Imogen Sterne was 22 in the April of 1817, the only daughter of the late Mr. Charles Sterne, deceased in the autumn of 1814, and of the late Lady Lavinia Sterne, who had died in childbed of a stillborn second child in the summer of 1801, when Imogen was 6. Of her mother, she retained 3 small fragments and no more, a pale soft hand, laid for one cool moment against her temple in a darkened room, a soft contralto voice singing a French air, and the smell of orange flower water on a linen pillow. Everything else of Lavinia, the few miniatures, the handful of letters, the small painted fan, had been thrown into the kitchen fire by Mr. Roderick Crouch with his own hand in October 1814, 3 weeks after Charles Sterne's funeral. Mrs. Tabitha Wainwright, who had been Lavinia's lady's maid before Imogen's birth, and was Imogen's nurse from the day of Lavinia's death, had not been able to save them. Charles Sterne had married a second time in 1810, the bride being Mrs. Petronella Crouch, widow of a small Birmingham linen draper, who had brought with her a son of 21, Roderick by name. Charles had settled upon Imogen the small Shropshire estate and £600 a year, to come into her own at 25. He had not anticipated that his stepson would, within 3 weeks of his funeral, take the household into his own hand. Roderick had done so. The silver had gone to a Birmingham silversmith in November of 1814, the library to a London bookseller in December, the horses to Shrewsbury Fair across the spring, the linen to a Welsh draper at Welshpool. By April of 1817 there remained the entail, the walls, and Mrs. Tabitha Wainwright, kept on at half wages. Imogen herself had been kept on the allowance of an upper housemaid, £14 a year. What Roderick had not found, in 3.5 years of careful selling, was the one thing Tabitha had hidden at the bottom of a cedar trunk in the corner of Imogen's own bedroom, an ivory blonde lace wedding veil, folded in cedar shavings beneath plain nightgowns of no value, untouched since the summer of 1801. Tabitha had hidden it on the morning of Lady Lavinia's funeral, and had said nothing of it to any soul living. The veil had been made in the spring of 1796 by a French émigré lacemaker, Madame Larocque of Bath, against Lavinia's wedding, in the June of that year. 6 counties to the south, at Aldermere Priory in Worcestershire, on the morning of the 3rd of March, 1817, a young man of 28 sat in his study, holding a letter he had read 3 times. He was tall, 6'1", lean and broad-shouldered, with thick, dark, walnut-brown, wavy hair, faint silver at the right temple, cool, clear, pale, grey-blue eyes, which had been called cold by people who had not known him long, fair, faintly weathered skin, and a strong, angular face. Upon the 3rd finger of his right hand was the heavy silver Aldermere ducal signet, a falcon with a key in its talons over a chevron. He was Alaric Henry Mountford, 7th Duke of Aldermere, and the letter was from Mr. Roderick Crouch of Sterne House, Aston-upon-Wenlock. It was, upon its surface, civil. Underneath it was an offer. Mr. Crouch had been informed that His Grace's solicitors had for 14 months been inquiring after any surviving daughter of the late Lady Lavinia Sterne. He confirmed that Miss Imogen Sterne resided under his stepmother's guardianship, that she was unmarried and of 22, and that, should His Grace be minded to consider a matrimonial arrangement, Mr. Crouch would entertain the matter. He proposed, by way of private guardian's gratuity, the sum of £15,000 to be paid him upon the wedding morning. The deathbed wish had been put to the Duke by his own mother, Lady Octavia Mountford, in November of 1815, 3 days before she died. Octavia and Lavinia Ashby had been schoolfellows at Bath in 1788, and twin sisters of choice ever after. Octavia had stood as godmother to Imogen at her christening in 1795. Though Imogen had no memory of her godmother, and no knowledge any such relation had ever existed, Octavia had spent her last week writing 2 letters carrying the same instruction. Find Lavinia Ashby's daughter. See that she is provided for. Mr. Crispin Brown of Lincoln's Inn had been searching since January 1816 and had identified Imogen at Sterne House in the 3rd week of February. The Duke rang and sent for his elder sister, Lady Verity Mountford Evershed, 32, soft chestnut-brown hair pinned in a neat coronet beneath a small grey lace widow's cap, shrewd, warm grey eyes very like her brother's, in lavender silk, half mourning. He gave her the letter without preamble. Lady Verity read it twice and laid it down upon the table with great care, as one lays down a thing too sharp to be left where a child might find it. "Alaric," she said, "the man is selling her. You may discharge his asking price out of my own pin money if necessary, but you will go and find that child. Mamma would have you do it. Lavinia's daughter has had no friends in this world for 16 years. The Duke wrote back that day. He agreed in principle to the marriage. He did not enclose the £15,000. He referred the matter to Mr. Brown, with the instruction that the settlement was to be drawn for the bride alone, and that any private payment to Mr. Crouch was to be held in strict abeyance. On the 11th of April, he travelled to Shropshire by post-chaise, arrived at Aston-upon-Wenlock at 4 in the afternoon, and put up at the King's Arms upon the High Street. Lady Verity, who had come down with him, took the parlour above his, and so it was that, on the morning of the 12th of April, 11 o'clock having struck, Mr. Roderick Crouch had told Miss Imogen Sterne what veil she was to wear in the parish church of St. Chad's at 10:30 the following morning. Imogen drew the small silver locket out from beneath the white lawn fichu at her throat, her mother's locket on its black silk cord, the only ornament Tabitha had saved, pressed it once against her breastbone, tucked it back, and walked up the back stair to her bedroom in the eastern wing. Tabitha was already there. Mrs. Tabitha Wainwright, 64, silver-white hair beneath a starched white linen cap, warm, faded, pale blue eyes, weathered Welsh borders fair skin, small 5'1" and bony in plain black bombazine, brisk upon her ash walking-stick. The cedar trunk, stood at the foot of Imogen's narrow bed, the lid open, the nightgowns turned back. Tabitha was lifting in both her old hands a fold of pale ivory blonde lace. She laid the veil across the white counterpane. The lace, in the cold, pale blue April light, was the colour of a candle seen through fine linen. Imogen came to the bedside and lifted the lace in both her own hands. She had never seen it before in her life. She felt it cool and weightless across her palms, and saw the pattern of small flowering vine, 6-petalled flowers and slender curling tendrils. Work so fine she could not, for a long moment, follow it with her eyes. "It was your mother's," Tabitha said quietly. "She was wed in it in St. Chad's, in the June of '96. The lace was made by a Madame Larocque of Bath. She kept it folded in this trunk against your wedding day. I hid it here on the morning we buried her. I have not told a single soul since. It has been here under those nightgowns for 16 years. Imogen did not, for a full minute, say a word. She held the lace in both hands and looked down at it. "Tabby," she said at last, and her clear, soft contralto was as steady as Tabitha had ever heard it. "I shall wear it tomorrow with thanks. You have kept it for me a very long time. I shall not forget." Tabitha laid one age-spotted hand upon the dark honey hair at Imogen's temple, took it away again, and did not weep where the child could see her. She folded the veil back into the cedar shavings and closed the lid. At 11:45, the wheels of a hired post-chaise turned in at the worn iron gate of Sterne House. Roderick Crouch received His Grace the 7th Duke of Aldermere into the drawing-room with a great deal of oily ceremony. Mrs. Petronella Crouch, 54, faded mouse-brown hair under a dingy white lace cap with rusty pink ribbons, watery pale blue eyes easily startled in plum bombazine, sat at her embroidery in the corner and did not look up from her needle. The Duke, in dark blue superfine travelling tailcoat, white cravat, dove-grey silk waistcoat, charcoal pantaloons, and polished black Hessian boots, took the chair he was offered and asked, civilly, that Miss Sterne be sent for. Imogen came in from the garden. She wore the plain, high-waisted, slate-grey wool morning gown, 3 years out of cut, the white lawn fichu at her throat, the silver locket beneath, the plain white linen working cap pinned over the dark honey-blonde hair, smoothed in its low chignon at the nape. Her clear, sea-green eyes were composed and unhopeful. She dropped the Duke a small, precise curtsy at the door. The Duke, who had taken her measure in 3 steady seconds, rose and motioned her to a chair facing his own. He spoke to her, for the next quarter of an hour, gently and plainly. He asked her 3 questions. He asked her what she remembered of her mother. He asked her in what year her mother had died. He asked her whether any letter or miniature was at present in her keeping. To the first she answered, in a soft contralto so well composed that the pain in it was not a pain any unkind ear would have heard, that she remembered 3 things only: a pale hand at her temple, a French air sung in a soft voice, and the smell of orange flower water upon a linen pillow. To the second, that her mother had died in the summer of 1801, in childbed of a second child, who had not lived. To the third, that she had nothing of her mother's at all, save a small silver locket her old nurse had saved. Twice Roderick attempted to interject. The Duke, without raising his voice, or his pale grey-blue gaze from Imogen's face, courteously prevented him each time. The second time, the Duke said, evenly, "Mr. Crouch, I am addressing my question to Miss Sterne. I shall come to the matter of yourself at the proper hour." Roderick subsided. Lady Verity, who had walked over from the King's Arms a quarter of an hour earlier and had been admitted at the side door by Tabitha into the small adjoining morning-room behind the half-open painted screen, listened to every word of the interview without a sound. At 1 o'clock, in the King's Arms parlour above the High Street, drinking tea with her brother by the small bright fire, she said only one sentence, evenly. "Alaric, that child has been waiting for 16 years for one human person to ask her a question about her mother." The Duke set his cup down carefully. He looked into the fire for a steady length of seconds. Then he said, "Verity, the child has been kept like a parlour-maid in her own father's house. She has had no friends. She has been told nothing of her mother. She is composed, intelligent, and entirely defenceless. We shall marry tomorrow at 10:30. We shall remove her from that house in the wedding carriage by 11:30. She shall not return." Lady Verity looked at her brother across the small parlour table. "I have ordered the second carriage," she said. "I shall sit at the Crouch breakfast table with you tomorrow morning if it kills me. Thank God Mamma lived to ask you this." Wednesday, the 13th of April, broke clear and cold and pale. By 9 Tabitha had Imogen out of the working dress and into the fine high-waisted ivory cream silk Lady Verity had run up overnight from a length of her own keeping. Short puff sleeves, a narrow row of seed pearls at the hem, a small posy of primroses pinned at the waist. The dark honey hair was smoothed in a low chignon. The silver locket lay beneath the bodice. The plain white silk gloves were drawn on. Tabitha brought up the veil last, in her trembling old hands. She bent her silver-white head and kissed the lace once, very softly, where the small French vine flowered. Then she lifted it with both hands and laid it over the dark honey hair of the bride. The lace fell along the line of her brow and down her shoulders. Tabitha stepped away and did not speak, because she could not. Mr. Crispin Brown, of Lincoln's Inn, 1:50, thinning grey hair combed back, gold-rimmed spectacles, plain black superfine, who had been the bride's quiet ally for 48 hours, gave her his arm at the lich gate. Tabitha walked behind in clean black bombazine with a small jet brooch. Lady Verity walked behind Tabitha in lavender silk, half-mourning. The cold, pale blue April light came down through the leafless yews. Primroses were tied to each pew end. St. Chad's was the small 14th-century stone church Imogen had seen each morning of her life from her eastern bedroom window. Square Welsh borders tower, narrow lancet windows, plain oak pews, a small Norman font, half the village in the nave in clean Sunday black. Reverend Cyril Hollington, 47, soft sandy grey hair, hazel eyes behind small gold-rimmed spectacles, in white linen surplice over black cassock with white collar band and small silver crucifix on a black silk cord, stood at the altar with the open book of common prayer. Lady Verity took her place in the front pew on the bride's side. Tabitha took her place behind. Mrs. Petronella, in the second pew opposite, fluttered at her embroidery bag and did not lift her watery eyes. Roderick stood with cool ostentation by the chancel rail. The Duke waited at the altar, plain dark grey superfine tailcoat, high white starched cravat, white silk waistcoat with the very faint dove-grey pinstripe, white pantaloons, polished black Hessian boots, the Aldermere ducal signet upon the third finger of his right hand, a single small sprig of white narcissus at his lapel. He turned his head when he heard the lich gate. Imogen came up the aisle on Mr. Brown's arm. The Duke saw the ivory silk and the ivory blonde lace veil, and at the corner of the lace just above her right temple, a faint shape in the pale blue April light through the lancet windows that he could not yet quite make out. Reverend Hollington asked the questions the book required of him. Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife? Wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband? Alaric Henry Mountford answered in a measured, deep, clear baritone, I will. Imogen Charlotte Sterne answered in her clear, soft contralto, I will. The plain silver ring, engraved upon its inner face, with the Aldermere falcon with key, was given. The vows were exchanged in the words of the book. With this ring I thee wed, with my body I thee honour, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow. Reverend Hollington, his hazel eyes very steady behind the small gold-rimmed spectacles, joined their right hands and pronounced them husband and wife together, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Then by the long, quiet English custom, the groom lifted the veil. He lifted it slowly with both hands. The lace came up along the line of her brow, and fell back along the dark honey hair to her shoulders. He saw her face then, for the first time without the lace before it. And he saw, in the same instant, what had been embroidered at the corner of the veil, just where it had rested above her right temple, 2 entwined initials in tiny silver thread, no thicker than a hair, O.M. set against L.A., and beneath them a date stitched in the same fine silver, June 17th, 1796. He recognized his own mother's hand at once. He had seen the small private way she made her capitals all his life, the looped O, the slender M, the quiet bar of the date. He had seen the very same fine French lacework in his own mother's keeping all his 28 years, done by Madame Larocque of Bath, his mother's lacemaker for 40 years. He had not, until this minute, known that his mother had given Lavinia Ashby a veil at Lavinia's wedding. His mother had not, in 28 years, told him. Octavia Mountford, Lavinia Ashby, June the 17th, 1796. Octavia's wedding gift to her oldest friend on Lavinia's wedding day, and Lavinia's daughter wearing it now, at her own altar, 21 years later, on the cold, pale blue Welsh borders morning of the 13th of April, 1817. He stood quite still for 10 seconds, looking at the entwined initials in the lace at the bride's temple. Then he leaned down 1/4 inch toward Imogen's ear and whispered, so that not Reverend Hollington at the altar, nor Lady Verity in the front pew, nor Mr. Brown at his shoulder heard him. Only Imogen herself. Madame, I have just discovered, in the corner of the veil at your brow, my mother's monogram beside your mother's, and the date of your mother's wedding, stitched in silver thread. I had not known until this minute that the veil was hers. I shall tell you the rest in the carriage. I should be obliged if you would smile politely until we are out of this church. She blinked once. She lifted her chin 1/4 inch. She did not weep. She gave him, with quiet, astonishing composure, a small, precise, public smile of the kind one gives an acquaintance one has known for years. Reverend Hollington raised his hand and gave them the blessing. The bells of St. Chad's broke into the cold, pale blue air above the rise. The small Shropshire choir of 7, gathered behind the rood screen in their plain Sunday black, lifted their voices and gave them, very quietly and in the Welsh as they had always sung it, the old border country wedding air Our Heidi Knows. They went with Reverend Hollington into the small vestry and signed the register. Imogen Charlotte Sterne Mountford in her clear schoolroom hand, Alaric Henry Mountford in his. They came back out together along the plain oak pews of the nave, the Duke's right arm under hers, the lifted veil drawn back along her dark honey hair, the small silver embroidery at the corner of the lace, catching the cold, pale blue April light. Lady Verity rose from the front pew and fell in behind them with Tabitha at her elbow and Mr. Brown at Tabitha's. Mrs. Petronella did not lift her head. Roderick Crouch turned at the chancel rail and saw the carriage waiting beyond the lych gate and did not yet understand what he had just lost. They stepped out of the lych gate of St. Chad's into the cold, pale blue April Shropshire light. The villagers who had gathered along the path with their small bunches in their hands threw the primroses at the bride's feet. The wedding carriage stood beyond the lych gate, with the Aldermere falcon and key upon the door, the second carriage at its back, the 4 bay horses standing patient in the chill. Lady Verity came down the path behind them with Tabitha and Mr. Brown. The bells of St. Chad's rang on across the rise. The wedding carriage rolled away from the lych gate of St. Chad's at 25 past 11 on the cold, pale blue morning of the 13th of April, 1817. The 4 bay horses took the rise of the lane at a steady walk, and as the iron-rimmed wheels found their first turn upon the gravel, the bells in the square Welsh Borders tower behind them rang on out across the Shropshire upland. Within, upon the deep blue cloth of the seat, Imogen sat upright in her ivory cream silk wedding gown, with the narrow row of seed pearls along the hem and the posy of primroses at the waist. The white silk gloves were drawn smoothly upon her hands. The silver locket lay hidden beneath the bodice. The ivory blonde lace veil, lifted now from her brow, had been folded back along her dark honey-blonde hair and lay across her left shoulder, so that the corner where Madame Larocque of Bath had set the entwined initials and the silver thread date caught the pale blue April light at every fresh turn of the road. The Duke of Aldermere sat opposite her in his plain, dark grey, superfine tailcoat, the high, white starched cravat, the white silk waistcoat with the faint dove-grey pinstripe, white pantaloons, polished black Hessian boots, the silver Aldermere signet upon his right hand, the sprig of white narcissus at his lapel, still fresh from the vestry. His pale grey-blue eyes rested upon his wife's gloved hands, and not upon her face, that he might give her the small dignity of being looked at sideways and not square. Behind them, half a furlong back, the second carriage carried Lady Verity Mountford Evershed in lavender silk, half mourning, Mrs. Tabitha Wainwright in clean black bombazine, and Mr. Crispin Brown with the leather portfolio upon his knee. Alaric drew breath and began to tell his wife the rest. He told her, in his measured, deep, clear baritone, that his late mother and her late mother had been schoolfellows at Bath in 1788, when each had been a girl of 14, sent up to a small academy upon the Royal Crescent. The friendship begun there had lasted 13 years, until Lavinia's death in 1801. The two had written each month without exception. Lady Octavia had stood as godmother to Imogen at her christening at St. Chad's in the spring of 1795. Imogen had borne, since that morning, a godmother of whose existence she had never been told. He told her of his mother's deathbed in November of 1815, upon which Octavia, knowing herself going, had asked of him one thing, that he should find Lady Lavinia's daughter and ensure that she should be provided for. He told her of the 14-month search through Mr. Crispin Brown, inquiries through London, on through Birmingham, at last to Shrewsbury, and of the 3rd week of February, when Mr. Brown had identified her at Sterne House. He told her of the letter from her stepbrother on the 3rd of March, in which Mr. Crouch had proposed, by way of guardian's gratuity, the sum of £15,000 upon the wedding morning, in addition to whatever settlement his Grace might make upon his bride. He told her, evenly, that the £15,000 had not been paid, would not be paid, and that the settlement had been drawn for the bride alone. The decision had not been to negotiate with such a man, but to marry her and remove her from his house in the same forenoon. The marriage was for him no transaction with Mr. Crouch. He had come to Shropshire upon the keeping of his mother's last wish. He had married her in the discharge of a debt he owed Lady Octavia. He proposed nothing more of it now. He fell silent and watched a white milestone slide past beyond the carriage window. Imogen Charlotte Sterne Mountford, Duchess of Aldermere of 1/2 hour, sat very still with her gloved hands folded in her lap. Her clear sea-green eyes had not moved from his face for the last 7 minutes. The silver locket beneath her bodice rose and fell with each careful breath. She did not speak for 2 long miles. She let the cold April light come in upon the lifted lace at her shoulder. The bells of St. Chad's had given place to the measured drum of the 4 bay horses upon the lane. Then when she did speak at last, her clear, soft contralto came as steady as it had come at the altar. "Your Grace," she said, "I had not known I had been remembered. By anyone, by any person living. I shall need a little time to consider what one does with the news that one has been remembered for 16 years. I shall not, however, take longer than I must. I find, already, that I am in a very small private hurry to begin to deserve it." The Duke inclined his head 1/4 of an inch in the courtly manner of a man receiving a promise upon a Bible. "Madam," he said, "you have been deserving it for 16 years. You may have the time. I shall be at Aldermere when you are ready." He did not reach across the carriage and take her hand. He did not lean towards her. He let the silence between them settle as a thing welcome rather than a thing to be filled. The carriage drew up briefly before the King's Arms to take up the last of Lady Verity's trunks. Mr. Roderick Crouch and his mother, having returned to Sterne House for a wedding breakfast that no one upon the bride's side intended to attend, were not present, and the high street stood almost empty. The postboy handed up the trunks, the bay horses turned their heads west, and at 12 minutes past noon the carriages went out at the southern end of the village, onto the post road for Worcestershire, and the steeple of St. Chad's that Imogen had seen each morning of her life from her eastern bedroom window, slipped behind the rise and out of sight. They drove on west. The Welsh border country gave them the soft, folded greys and greens of the Clune forest, low stone walls bleached silver after a hard winter, the first primrose yellow of the bank tops, the first cuckoo of the year calling thinly over the rise. After Ludlow, the road bent southeast. The country opened. The Severn appeared upon their right hand, broad and slate-grey and steady, and they went down with it under the cold, pale sky, towards Bewdley. At 20 minutes before 4, the wedding carriage drew up at the bridge of Bewdley Post House, a low, half-timbered inn upon the eastern bank, where the postmaster came out with 2 ostlers and 4 fresh bays. The change, he said, would take 20 minutes. Would their graces be pleased to take tea in the parlour to the riverside? The parlour was a clean, low-panelled room, with a small fire, a round oak table set for 3, and a leaded window giving upon the wide, steady Severn. Lady Verity, stepping down from the second carriage, sent Tabitha to take a cup in the kitchen and Mr. Brown out to look the new team over, and came in herself. Alaric, who had risen at her step, said mildly that he would step out and look the offside leader over with Mr. Brown, and closed the door very gently. Lady Verity took a Windsor chair. The house-girl brought in the tray, brown teapot, 3 plain white cups, a dish of bread and butter cut very thin. Lady Verity poured for Imogen and for herself, and waited until the door had closed. "Imogen," she said gently, "I should like, while my brother is in the yard, to tell you 3 small things. They are 3 I have been carrying for a long while. I shall be quick." Imogen lifted her clear sea-green eyes from the small dish. "Please," she said. Lady Verity set down her cup. "First, in the August of 1791, when my mother and yours were each 17, my mother wrote your mother a letter from Aldermere. I have it still in the rosewood box upon the library mantel. I memorized it when I was 14. The line I should like you to have is this: 'My dear Lavinia, I think we have decided that we shall be old women together one day, with very white hair and very few teeth, and that we shall sit in a window at Bath and laugh at the new young women in their new young hats, and that no creature alive shall be permitted to part us upon any pretence whatever. Pray do not consent to be parted from me before we have had the chance.' They were not parted in any matter of the heart for the next 10 years. Imogen set her cup down very carefully upon the saucer. Second, in the November of 1797, against your mother's birthday, my mother sent her a small enamelled rosewater bottle, blue and white, with a fine silver stopper, from a jeweller at Bath. She had had your mother's initials chased upon the stopper in the same hand the lace upon your shoulder bears at its corner. I do not know whether the bottle is still in this world. I should like you, all the same, to know that it was sent. Imogen pressed her gloved hand once to the silver locket beneath the bodice. She did not yet speak. Third, in the September of 1799, your mother came up to Aldermere for an afternoon. She was at Worcester upon some small business with her own mother's lawyer, and drove the 7 miles to take tea with my mother, and she brought you. You were 4 years old. My mother had had a small white-painted cradle set up in the southwest sitting-room, in case you should be tired by the carriage, and you were, and you slept the whole afternoon in the cradle while your mother and mine took tea and talked. I was 14. I sat upon the window-seat with a piece of cross-stitch on my lap, and I listened to them. You did not wake. My mother went over to the cradle once, before your mother carried you back out at 5 o'clock, and stood looking down at you for the better part of 2 minutes, and she said, I remember this. Lavinia, she has your brow exactly. Promise me, if anything ever happens to either of us, the other will see to her. She is the best thing either of us has done. Your mother said, Octavia, I promise. Then they went out, and you went home asleep on your mother's shoulder, and you have not, I think, ever in your life been told you had been at Aldermere, in your mother's arms, when you were 4. Imogen's sea-green eyes did not move from Lady Verity's face. The fire shifted in the grate. The 7 ran steady beyond the leaded window. From the inn-yard came the low voice of the Duke, speaking to Mr. Brown about a girth. Lady Verity, Imogen said after a long moment, thank you. I shall keep all 3. I shall ask you for them again, in some quieter hour, that I may write them down. You shall have them, Lady Verity said. You shall have everything I have. She lifted her cup, drank her tea, and said no more. The Duke came back at 6 minutes before 4. The postmaster tapped to say the team was put to. Lady Verity rose, kissed Imogen once upon the temple, and went out to her own carriage. The wedding carriage took the road again, and the 7 slid away upon their right hand, and they went on west into Worcestershire under the cold, pale blue April light. For perhaps 1.5 miles, Imogen sat composedly upright, with her gloved hands folded in her lap. Then her shoulders moved a very little, her chin came down by 1/4 inch, and she wept, once, quietly, for the mother she had been allowed to know nothing of. For the August letter of 1791, for the small enamelled rosewater bottle of 1797, for the autumn afternoon of 1799, in which she had slept the whole of her own visit at Aldermere, in a small white-painted cradle, and had not, in 18 years, been told she had been there. She wept for 30 seconds. She did not make a sound. Alaric did not speak. He drew his clean white linen handkerchief out of the inner pocket of his tailcoat, unfolded it once into his hand, and set it across the seat at her right hand, without looking at her. She took it up. Madam, he said, after she had pressed the linen once, and then again to her cheek. I am very sorry. I shall not press you with conversation between here and Aldermere. She inclined her head. She wept very quietly for a further 20 seconds. Then she drew one careful breath, straightened her shoulders, refolded the handkerchief into a small clean square upon her lap, and set her sea-green eyes upon the cold, pale blue Worcestershire fields beyond the carriage window. She did not weep again that day. The road bent south through Stourport, then west under the long shoulder of the Aberley Hills. In the village of Whitley, the carriage slowed for a flock of sheep, and the shepherd, recognising the falcon and key upon the door, took off his hat and stood bareheaded while they passed. Imogen, who had not before seen any soul salute her, inclined her head to him gravely as the door went by. At 7:20, with the cold, pale blue April day going towards its last quarter, and the first thin star showing low over the Malverns, the wedding carriage turned in at the great gate of Aldermere Priory. The avenue of beech trees ran a full half-mile up the slow rise to the house. The trees were old, planted by the third Duke 120 years before, their grey trunks close set on either hand of the gravel, the bare upper branches just beginning to break into the first pale green points of leaf. Between the trunks, as the carriage took the gentle bend, the honey-coloured Cotswold stone Palladian front of the priory came into view, a long symmetrical front of 3 stories, the central pediment carved with the Aldermere arms, the tall sash windows lit pale gold from within, the steps before the great door swept clean, and upon the steps, in a long, quiet line, the household turned out to receive their new Duchess. Mrs. Selina Doddington stood at the head of the line, her 60 years upright upon her stout 5'2", iron-grey hair in a low bun, beneath a starched white linen cap with narrow lace edging, warm, pale-grey eyes set deep in the crow's feet of a faintly rosy, kind round face, in plain black bombazine and white linen apron, the great bunch of keys upon the silver chatelaine at her waist, the grey wool shawl drawn snug. Beside her stood Mr. Augustus Bartlett, 49, close-cropped iron-grey hair, just receding above steady, pale blue eyes, the tanned, square, honest face, clean-shaven, the long-heeled, thin chin-scar pale in the lamplight, his broad, lean 5'10" frame easy upon the step, in dark brown country coat, buff waistcoat, brown cord breeches, brown leather gaiters, the leather-bound estate ledger beneath his arm. Behind them, in a long, quiet line, stood 30 servants in clean black, every face turned towards the carriage. The Duke handed his wife down himself. Imogen set her white silk slipper upon the swept gravel and felt the cold, pale blue Worcestershire air, smelling of beech leaf and wood smoke, come up about her. The veil was still folded over her left shoulder. The small silver embroidery at the corner caught the lamplight from the open hall. Mrs. Doddington came forward 1 step, dropped a deep, careful curtsy of the kind a girl of 19 had once been trained in 41 years before, lifted her warm, pale grey eyes once to Imogen's face, and spoke steadily. "Welcome home, Your Grace." Imogen returned the curtsy by a small, precise inclination of her head. "Thank you, Mrs. Doddington," she said, in the clear, soft contralto. "I am very glad to be at Aldermere." She went along the line. Mrs. Doddington walked at her right elbow, and at each name said it quietly and clearly: Mr. Bartlett, the steward; Mrs. Pike, the cook; Mr. Hadley, the butler; James, the upper footman; Susan, the upper housemaid. On and on, the length of the long line in the cold, pale blue dusk. Imogen gave each her hand, and spoke to each by name after Mrs. Doddington had given it. To the cook she said she had heard of a certain raised pie made at Aldermere on St. Stephen's Day. To Susan she said only, gravely, "I shall be glad to learn from you the way of the linen cupboard." She did not, in the whole length of the line, miss one of them. When she had reached the last, a small, pinched apprentice boot-boy of 14 called Tom, she shook his hand gravely and went with the Duke into the long lit hall. In the steward's room behind the green baize door, when the line had broken up, Mrs. Doddington and Mr. Bartlett stood for a moment together at the small stone fire. Mrs. Doddington drew the grey wool shawl about her shoulders and looked into the small glow of the coals. "Mr. Bartlett, we have a duchess. She did not miss one of them. Lady Octavia would have liked her." Mr. Bartlett laid the leather-bound estate ledger down upon the corner of the deal table and gave one small, slow nod. Supper was set in the small green dining room upon the south side of the house, a clear fire built up, and the green damask curtains drawn against the dusk. 3 covers only. The Duke at the head of the round table, Lady Verity upon his left, Imogen upon his right. Clear soup, a small loin of mutton, new potatoes, stewed apples with cream. The conversation was civil, polite, quiet. Lady Verity spoke of the avenue, of the late frost upon the rose garden, of the small hatch of pheasant. The Duke spoke of the road from Bewdley. Imogen, eating very little, spoke when she was spoken to, and listened when she was not, and at 5 minutes past 9 set her napkin upon the cloth and rose. The Duke rose at once. He took her himself up the broad, shallow oak staircase, along the long gallery hung with the Mountford line, to the door of the blue guest chamber upon the south-east corner. The door stood open. Mrs. Doddington had been before them. A small, bright fire in the marble grate, fresh white linen turned down upon the 4-poster. 2 wax candles in silver sticks upon the dressing-table, the tall leaded window curtained against the dusk, the silver chest at the foot of the bed swept clean, a brass warming pan just being drawn out by Susan, who curtsied and slipped past them at the door. "Madam," the Duke said, standing a careful pace from the threshold and not entering it. "This is your room. It is yours until further notice, and the further notice shall be of your asking, and not of mine. I shall not propose to enter your chamber upon any terms but your own consent in some hereafter. Should that hereafter never come, this room is still yours. Mrs. Wainwright sleeps next door. I wish you a good night." Imogen looked up at him gravely. "Your Grace," she said, "I thank you. I wish you the same." He inclined his head once, a quiet bow of the kind a man of careful breeding makes at the door of a country house, and walked away down the long gallery. Tabitha came out of the dressing-chamber at the inner door, the ash walking-stick already against the wall, and undressed her child without conversation, took the gloves from her, drew the silk gown from her shoulders, took down the dark honey hair from its chignon, and rebraided it loosely for the night, dressed her in a plain nightgown of soft white linen and a white wrapper. She set the silver locket upon the dressing-table at the bedhead. She lifted, last, the ivory blonde lace veil from Imogen's shoulder, and laid it with great care upon the silver chest at the foot of the bed, the corner with the entwined initials and silver thread date turned uppermost to the light. She touched her old hand once to Imogen's cheek, said quietly, "Good night, my lamb," and closed the inner door behind her. Imogen did not at once go to bed. She crossed in her white wrapper to the tall leaded window, drew back one panel of the heavy blue silk curtain, and looked out. The cold, pale blue April night had come down over the chestnut avenue and the rose garden and the long sweep of the Worcestershire park. A thin half-moon stood low above the line of the Malverns. 11:30 had just begun to strike, very softly, from a clock down the long gallery. 11 slow small chimes, and 1 half-chime more. She turned from the window. She crossed back to the foot of the bed. She knelt upon the polished oak boards beside the silver chest. She laid her hand, very gently, flat upon the corner of the ivory blonde lace, where the silver embroidery caught the candlelight, upon the looped O and the slender M, and the quiet bar of the date, June 17th. 1796, and the entwined L.A. set against them all. She said aloud, very quietly, her first English sentence in her own house at 22, "Mamma, I am at Aldermere." She woke at 6, in the blue guest chamber of Aldermere Priory, to the soft, pale blue light of a Worcestershire April morning lifting along the silk-papered walls, The four-poster bed was hung in soft blue silk, and the leaded window at the far side of the chamber stood half open upon the deer park, where the mist still lay along the chestnut avenue, and a single thrush was singing in the new-leaved oaks. The fire had burned low to a small orange heart in the marble grate. The ivory-blonde lace veil lay folded upon the silver chest at the foot of the bed, the corner with its silver thread embroidery turned uppermost to the light. Imogen lay still and looked at it. The thrush sang again. She rose and put on the white wrapper and went to the leaded window. A fallow doe had brought her fawn out into the open grass below the south terrace, and the two stood cropping the new April growth, as if neither the house nor the woman at the leaded window were any concern of theirs. Imogen watched them a long time. She had not, in 3 years at Sterne House, looked from any window upon any creature that had not been counted in Mr. Roderick Crouch's ledger as a sum to be obtained. At 6:30, Tabitha Wainwright came in with the morning tray, tea in a small white china pot, hot water in a silver jug, 2 thin slices of bread and butter, a small dish of strawberry preserve. She set it down without speaking and went to the wardrobe in the dressing-chamber and brought out the soft, fawn-grey wool morning gown, one of 3 new gowns Lady Verity had ordered down from her own London dressmaker before the wedding, knowing Imogen would come to Aldermere with nothing in the world but the slate-grey wool of 3 years' service and the ivory cream silk in which she had been married. High-waisted, long-sleeved, soft as a March cloud, simply cut, Tabitha brought out the cream cashmere shawl, a clean white lawn fichu, fine grey worsted stockings, plain black slippers. She dressed Imogen at the leaded window, drew up the dark honey hair into the smooth low chignon at the nape, set the silver locket upon its black silk cord beneath the lawn fichu, and folded the cream cashmere shawl about her shoulders. "The breakfast room is the small green one upon the east side, my lamb," Tabitha said quietly. "Mrs. Doddington has shown me the way." "Thank you, Tabby. I shall be in the dressing-chamber. There is a great deal of linen wants its turn." She went out through the inner door and left it ajar, and Imogen heard her presently moving about with the soft, purposeful tread of a woman who has, for the first time in 15 years, been given a wardrobe worth the keeping. At 8, Imogen went down. The long oak staircase, the long gallery hung with the Mountford line, the soft beeswax and old oak smell of a house kept by 60 years of careful hands, and the small green breakfast room upon the east side, where the leaded window gave upon a little gravel walk and a bed of pale yellow primroses just opening to the morning. The cloth was laid for 3. The Duke stood at the chimney-piece in dark walnut-brown morning coat and buff waistcoat, the heavy silver Aldermere signet upon his right hand, reading a letter. He set it down at once when she came in. Lady Verity was already at her place, in lavender silk, half-mourning, with a small jet brooch at her throat, pouring coffee from a tall silver pot. "Good morning, madame," the Duke said quietly. "I hope you slept." "I did, your Grace. Thank you." "Sit by me, my dear," said Lady Verity, with the small warm smile of a woman who has decided privately and finally to take her brother's wife into her keeping. They sat. The breakfast was plain: coffee, tea, hot rolls, butter, a small dish of cold ham, a covered silver dish of eggs. Lady Verity spoke of the rose garden and of the late frost. The Duke spoke of the home farms and of an under-tenant at Ferney, whose drainage wanted seeing to. He addressed his wife once, gently upon the matter of the pale yellow primroses just opening at the gravel walk, asked whether she liked primroses, was answered that she did, and inclined his head and said he should be glad to know it. At 9, he set down his napkin, rose, said, "Madame, Verity, I am with Mr. Bartlett at the home farms until 5. I shall be at tea." He bowed once at the door and went out. So it began. The next 10 days laid a quiet pattern over Aldermere Priory, such as a pale blue Worcestershire spring lays over a long neglected garden when the gardener has at last come back to it. The Duke kept his hours. He came to breakfast at 8. He left at 9 for the home farms, or for the long table in his study with Mr. Bartlett. He returned at 5 for tea in the small green saloon. He dined at 7. He did not press her conversation. He did not enter her chamber, nor approach the door of it. He spoke to her at breakfast and at tea and at dinner with the quiet, plain warmth of a husband who has determined that a wife shall not, in his house, be made to bear the smallest pressure of his presence, beyond what her own pace allowed. Mrs. Selina Doddington showed her the house-room by room over 4 days, briskly and with a quiet pride. The long Tudor Great Hall first, the hammer-beam roof above, and the dark oak panelling and the great fire kept lit since November. The worn flagstones where 6 generations of Mountfords had walked. The Georgian State Suite next, with its yellow silk hangings and its pale blue Wedgwood plaques. The library, 12,000 volumes upon dark walnut shelves, the small rosewood box upon the marble mantel with the late Lady Octavia's letters folded inside it. The long gallery, hung with the Mountford line. Imogen stood a little while before the Lawrence of Lady Octavia at 30 in white muslin with a rose, painted in 1798. A fair grave woman with cool, clear, pale grey-blue eyes, very like her son's. The music room with its broadwood pianoforte and a small gilt harp standing in the south corner. The walled rose garden, where the south wall already had 2 small pale pink buds breaking at its foot. The orangery with its old lemon trees in tubs. The chapel, small and stone cool and quiet. His Grace's mother used to take her own breakfast in the small green room at 8 o'clock when the family was here, Your Grace. Mrs. Doddington said quietly upon the first morning, as they came down the great oak stair. She liked the primroses at the east walk. Mrs. Doddington, I should be very glad to take mine there. It has been kept that way, Your Grace. Lady Verity walked with her each morning in the deer park. They went out at 9:30, after the Duke had gone to the farms, Imogen in the soft fawn-grey wool gown and the cream cashmere shawl, Lady Verity in lavender silk, half-mourning, along the long gravel walk under the chestnut avenue and back by the rose garden wall. By the 3rd morning, Lady Verity was telling her small, affectionate stories of the late Duchess, how Octavia had kept her own dairy book in her own hand, how she had walked this same walk in this same shawl every morning of her last spring. By the 7th morning, Imogen was answering with small, careful stories of Tabitha, of the cedar trunk, of how Tabitha had taught her French verbs at 6, because no governess could be afforded, of how on the wedding morning Tabitha had kissed the lace of the veil before she laid it upon her hair. Tabitha settled into the small dressing-chamber off the blue guest chamber with the brisk, quiet purpose of a woman who has at last been given a room she could call her own at the age of 64. She took quiet charge of Imogen's wardrobe, conferred privately with Mrs. Doddington in the still room upon the care of fine wool and cashmere and silk, pressed the gowns herself, folded the lace, kept the silver locket polished. She began, on the 3rd day, to speak with a small, soft, new authority in the servants' hall, and was attended to. The first cuckoo called from the home wood upon the morning of the 20th of April. Imogen heard it through her open leaded window at 6:30, and stood very still by the white linen of the made bed and listened. She had not heard a cuckoo since 1813. It was upon a still warm morning in the last week of April that the Duke took her, alone, to the late Duchess's apartments in the southwest wing. He sent for her after breakfast. Lady Verity had gone with Mrs. Doddington to inspect the linen presses upon the 3rd floor. Tabitha was in the dressing-chamber with the laundry-maid. The Duke stood by the leaded window at the foot of the long gallery, in his dark green country coat and buff waistcoat, looking out upon the south terrace, where the rose garden lay quiet in the warm, pale sun. He turned when he heard her step. "Madam," he said. "I should like, if you will, to show you a small room of my mother's that I have not yet shown you. Verity is not at home for an hour. I should prefer to take you alone." "Yes, Your Grace." He led her along the long gallery beneath the painted faces of the Mountford line, and down a quiet corridor of the southwest wing she had not yet walked in. At the far end stood a single door of dark walnut with a small brass handle. He opened it. He stood aside for her to go in first. The small sitting room beyond had pale cream walls and rose silk curtains drawn half back, a marble chimney-piece with a low fire newly laid and just kindled in the grate, 2 faded ivory silk wing-back chairs set on either side, a small mahogany writing desk by the window, and beyond an inner door that stood ajar a small bedchamber. The whole had the still untouched quiet of a room that had been kept exactly as it was on a particular afternoon 18 months before. Upon the writing desk lay a single quill, a small crystal inkwell with the silver lid laid back, a folded sheet of laid paper that had been begun and never finished, a small leather blotter, a paper knife of plain bone, a silver candlestick with a stub of a candle burnt 3/4 down. "My mother sat here on the 11th of November in the year 15, madam," the Duke said quietly. "She wrote 3 lines of a letter to my sister at that desk. She did not finish it. Mrs. Doddington has kept the room as it was. I have not, in 18 months, allowed it to be otherwise." Imogen stood a moment by the writing desk. She did not touch anything. She bent her head 1/4 of an inch toward the folded paper and saw the careful, slanted hand begin "My dearest Verity. My hands are cold this morning, and I shall come down to the small green room presently for some," and then break off, as if Lady Octavia had laid down the quill, to fetch another shawl from the bedchamber, and had simply not, in the event, returned. The Duke crossed to the foot of the writing desk. There stood, set close against the carved walnut leg, a small old French chest of dark walnut, lined within. One knew it was lined within, though one could not yet see, with silver leaf, a small key in the lock. He went down upon one knee beside it, in his dark green country coat, and turned the small key. The lock gave a small, clean click. He lifted the lid. Inside, upon folded white tissue paper, lay 2 folded pieces of ivory blonde lace. The Duke lifted aside the upper layer of tissue with great care. An ivory blonde lace wedding veil, folded in 3, and beneath it a pair of elbow-length ivory blonde lace gloves. The lace was of the same fineness, the same fall, the same pale ivory cream as the veil that lay at this hour upon the silver chest in the blue guest chamber. The hand of the same maker, Madame Larocque of Bath. "My mother's wedding set, madame," he said quietly. "Made for her by Madame Larocque in May of the year 86, against her own wedding upon the 5th of June following. Kept here, in this chest, in this room, for 31 years. Imogen knelt slowly down upon the polished oak boards beside him. She did not at once touch the lace. She looked at the veil a long, quiet moment. Then she lifted the upper corner of it between her finger and thumb, very gently, as a woman lifts a thing that has belonged to a woman she has never met, and brought the corner toward the warm, pale light of the leaded window. There, at the corner, just where the fold of the lace fell, embroidered in tiny silver thread, no thicker than a hair, in a small, careful hand she had now seen once before in her life, and would know to the end of her days, were the entwined initials, L.A. and O.M., and beneath them the small bar of the date, June 5th, 1786. She looked at it. She did not weep. Lavinia Ashby had, in May of 1786, ordered from Madame Larocque a wedding veil for her oldest friend against Octavia's wedding upon the 5th of June, and had stitched into the corner of it in tiny silver thread her own initials and her friend's, and the date. 10 years later, Octavia Mountford had ordered from the same Bath lace maker a wedding veil for Lavinia against her wedding upon the 17th of June following, and had stitched into the corner of it in the same tiny silver thread her own initials and her friends, and the date. 2 veils, exchanged at 2 weddings 10 years apart. The one had lain folded in this silver-lined chest in this small still room since November 1815. The other had been saved by a small old Welsh boarder's nurse with shaking hands in the bottom of a cedar trunk for 16 years, against the day her motherless lamb should at last be wed. Imogen set the corner of the veil back into the tissue. She lifted the elbow-length glove between her fingers a moment, looked at the soft fall of the lace, and laid it back beside the other. She laid the upper tissue back into place and closed the lid of the silver-lined chest. She turned the small key in the lock with a steady hand and gave him the key. She rose from the polished oak boards. He rose with her. She did not speak. She lifted his right hand, the heavy silver Aldermere signet warm against her palm, and held it a moment, and bent her dark honey head and kissed the back of his knuckles once, briefly and gravely. She set his hand quietly down again. She turned, the cream cashmere shawl drawn close, and walked alone out of the late Duchess's apartments without speaking. The Duke did not follow. He sat down slowly in the faded ivory silk wing-back chair upon the right of the chimney-piece, his hand laid flat upon the closed lid of the silver-lined chest, and for 10 minutes he did not move. The low fire crackled once in the grate. Then he rose, set the small key back upon its hook beside the chimney-piece, closed the door of his mother's apartments quietly behind him, and went back along the long gallery to his study. In the 2nd week of May, Mr. Crispin Brown arrived from London with the seed pearl earrings. He came up by post-chaise on a warm green morning when the chestnut avenue had begun to put out its pale candles, and the home wood was full of bluebells, and was shown into the small green saloon at 11 with a small leather case under his arm. The case was lined within in violet velvet. He set it upon the small rosewood table at Imogen's elbow, and opened it. 2 small pearls, well matched, of a clear soft cream, Lavinia Ashby's earrings, pawned by Mr. Roderick Crouch in October 1814, to a small Bath jeweller named Mr. Faulkner, traced through the pawnbroker's records by Mr. Brown, redeemed quietly out of the Aldermere settlement, and carried up by him in his own pocket. Imogen looked at them. She did not weep. "Mr. Brown," she said, "you have done my mother and me a kindness for which I shall not, in any year, find the thanks. Thank you. Your Grace. It was the most agreeable hour of my professional life." She set the case upon her dressing-table that evening. She did not yet wear the earrings. They lay in their violet velvet beside the silver locket and the ivory blonde lace veil for some days, while the cuckoo called in the home wood and the first roses opened on the south wall. In the 3rd week of May, a letter came from Mrs. Petronella Crouch, sent through Mr. Brown's London office. The hand shook upon the page. Mrs. Petronella had at last left her son's house and gone to her sister's at Hereford. She begged Imogen's forgiveness for 3 years of silent complicity. She did not, she wrote, expect to be answered. Imogen read it once. She gave it to Alaric across the breakfast table the next morning. He read it without speaking and gave it back. "Madam," he said, "the matter is yours." She dictated her reply that afternoon to Mr. Brown in the library. "Madam, I forgive you. I have arranged through Mr. Brown for a small annuity of £80 a year, to be paid to you privately upon condition only that you separate yourself entirely from your son's household and from his counsel, and that you take whatever lodging at Bath you should choose. Mrs. Petronella took the lodgings at Bath in the 3rd week of June, and was in time grateful. Through May, the slow domestic warming went on. Imogen began to walk in the rose garden after breakfast each morning, alone in the cream cashmere shawl, the first rosest roses opening daily on the south wall. She rode with the Duke upon the quiet bay mare Bryony, 15 hands, gentle eye, bought at Worcester 3 weeks before her arrival, along the long ride above the deer park. The Duke upon his big iron-grey hunter beside her at the walk, speaking quietly of the farms and the woods, and once of his mother. He read to her in the library after dinner, Cowper, then Crabbe, then Mr. Wordsworth, once or twice the new Miss Edgeworth, and upon her quiet leave, a single passage of Lady Octavia's letters from the small rosewood box upon the library mantel. He read the letters only with her permission. She gave it gently each evening. She began, in the late afternoons, to play the harp in the music room. She had not played in 15 years. The first afternoon, she sat down at the small gilt harp in the south corner and laid her fingers upon the strings and could not, for a full minute, remember how a C-string ought to sound. She found it. She played a single slow scale. Tabitha came in with her sewing and sat in the south window without a word, and stayed an hour. By the end of the 3rd week, Imogen was playing through, slowly and unsurely, the small old Welsh borders air the choir at St. Chad's had given them at the wedding. Upon a still warm late May evening, after dinner, Imogen and the Duke walked together in the walled rose garden. She wore the high-waisted, pale, primrose-yellow muslin morning gown with the short puff sleeves and the white lawn fichu, the silver locket beneath. He wore the dark green country coat. The first roses were just opening on the south wall, a pale pink bloom and a small cream one and a new bud, half loose upon its stem. Beeswax was warm upon the long gallery floor behind them. Fresh linen had been aired all day in the still room. Somewhere in the home, wood a thrush sang. He stopped at the corner of the gravel walk where the south wall turned. He did not touch her. He looked once at the first cream rose at its half open, and then at her, and said very quietly, "Madame, I have not yet thanked you for the grace with which you have undertaken an arrangement which I offered to you with very little of it." Imogen looked up at him. The pale primrose muslin moved softly at her wrist. "Your Grace, you have thanked me every morning at breakfast for 6 weeks by speaking to me as a husband should speak to his wife. I do not require more than that from you. I do not require it yet." He inclined his head once, gravely, in the small, careful bow that was his way at any threshold. He did not touch her. They walked back along the gravel path, beneath the south wall in the warm, still May dusk. The first cream rose just lit gold by the low westering sun behind them, and at the foot of the grand staircase, in the cool stone of the great hall, they parted, as they had parted every night since the wedding. June came in upon Aldermere Priory with a quiet fanfare of warmth. The first proper roses upon the south wall opened in earnest by the 2nd of the month. The pale pinks, the creams, and one deep crimson Mr. Bartlett had set in 15 years before, and which Mrs. Doddington always called the late Duchess's Rose. The deer in the park had their fawns, soft red-brown small things on long, uncertain legs that lay folded in the bracken at the wood's edge, while the does grazed steady at the rise. The Worcestershire weather settled gold and green. The long beech avenue showed full leaf at last. The Severn ran low and bright between its summer banks. Imogen had not been at any picnic, nor at any morning call worth the name, in 6 years. She did not yet know it, but the next month was to give her both. Sir Hubert Marlbrook and his wife paid their call upon the 7th of June. They had sent a civil note up 2 days before, and Mrs. Doddington had aired the pale green saloon and set a bowl of cream roses upon the small Pembroke table beneath the long sash. Sir Hubert came up the gravel sweep at 11 precisely in his own gig, his wife handed down by him with the easy ceremony of 40 years of marriage. He was 58, his thinning grey hair neat, his kindly hazel eyes steady in a ruddy country-fair face, clean-shaven. He stood 5'10" in his top boots, broad and solid, and wore his dark green country coat over a buff waistcoat and buff breeches, with a plain gold fob and a single seal at his watch pocket. His wife was 56, plump and small, her white-grey hair tucked under a soft lace cap, her pale blue silk morning gown of the cut of 7 years before, because she had never seen reason to alter what suited her. She was the kindest face Imogen had yet seen in Worcestershire, excepting Mrs. Doddington's. Imogen received them in fawn-grey wool, with a fresh white lawn fichu at the throat, and the silver locket on its black silk cord beneath. Lady Verity was beside her in lavender, her sewing folded upon the small work table in case it should be wanted. Sir Hubert came forward at once, took Imogen's offered hand in his own broad warm one, looked her quietly in the face for one steady second, and bowed. "Your Grace," he said in his soft Worcestershire burr, "I knew your husband's mother 28 years. I am very glad to make your acquaintance. You will forgive an old man for saying so plainly that the late Duchess would have been very glad of this morning." Imogen, who had not expected to be addressed so directly upon a first acquaintance, found that she could not, for a heart's beat, answer. Then she did. "Sir Hubert," she said, "I thank you. I am very glad to meet you." Lady Marlborough took her other hand and pressed it. "My dear," she said, "I am Charlotte Marlborough. I have lived 4 miles down the lane these 38 years. You shall always be very welcome at Marlborough Down." They sat. Mrs. Doddington brought in the tea. Sir Hubert spoke for 40 minutes with the easy candour of an old country neighbour, and in the middle of those 40 minutes, when the second pot of tea had been poured and the small plate of seed cake set down between them, he told Imogen, leaning a little forward in his chair, the one short story for which he had quietly come. "Your Grace, I shall not weary you with the late Duchess," he said, "but I shall tell you one thing of her, because I think it ought to be told. In the winter of '97, Lady Marlborough took a fever. She was 33 then, and I had not above 3 days' faith left in the apothecary at Worcester. Your husband's mother rode over to Marlborough Down on a Tuesday afternoon, in a snow that would have turned a less steady horse, and she sat with my wife from that Tuesday afternoon until the Friday morning. She slept 4 hours upon the boudoir sofa in the time. She sent for the apothecary at Hereford on her own credit. My wife is at this table because of her. I have not had occasion to tell that story to many people. I should be obliged that I told it to you." Imogen heard him out. Her gloved hands stayed folded composedly in her lap. She did not weep. She said after a small breath, "Sir Hubert, I thank you. I shall not forget it." Lady Marlborough reached across the small Pembroke table and patted her hand once, in the soft, brisk fashion of a kind aunt. Sir Hubert cleared his throat with the small, honest noise of a man who has said the only thing he came to say, and turned with practised ease to the prospects of the hay. The 40 minutes passed easily after that. At the end Sir Hubert rose, bowed, and said with the same easy candour, "We hold a small picnic at Marlborough Down upon the 24th in honour of my wife's birthday. It is a country thing, Your Grace. 20 couples, a cloth under the great oak, a string quartet from Worcester under a marquee, the children running about in the grass. My wife should be very glad to have you, the Duke and Lady Verity also, of course." Imogen looked once at Alaric. He had come quietly into the saloon at the 3rd quarter of the hour, and had stood at the long window without interrupting, and Alaric inclined his head. "We shall come, Sir Hubert," Imogen said. "I thank you." The Marlboroughs went away at 11:45. Lady Verity laid down her sewing and said very quietly, "Imogen, he came up here this morning to tell you that one story. He has known us all his life, and he came up here for that. Mamma would have loved him for it." Imogen said nothing. She walked once up the saloon and once back. Then she sat down in the south window in the sun, and she was very still, and Lady Verity, who had a great deal of practice in the kindnesses that did not require words, took up her sewing again and said no more. The mid-June call was less welcome and more amusing. Lady Verity's late husband's sister-in-law, Mrs. Cressida Evershed, had heard at Birmingham of the new Duchess of Aldermere, had no business at Aldermere whatever, and brought her daughters to call. She came up the gravel sweep at 2:30 on a Wednesday afternoon in a hired chaise, and Mrs. Doddington settled the party in the smaller saloon with a perfectly civil tea, and sent up a small note to Lady Verity that said only, in 2 underlined words, "Cressida Evershed." Lady Verity read the note. She set it down. She said to Imogen, "My dear, we are at home for 40 minutes. After that we shall not be." Mrs. Cressida was 47, faded but elegant, in plain grey silk that had been very expensive about the year of Trafalgar. Her 2 daughters, Miss Phoebe Evershed and Miss Honoria Evershed, were 22 and 20, both in white muslin, both with the small, bright, watchful eyes of girls who had been told that morning they were on no account to laugh at anything. Mrs. Cressida congratulated Imogen at considerable length upon the marriage, the house, the park, the avenue, and the weather. She told a story of a connection she fancied she had with the late Lady Octavia, which Lady Verity, with a face of polished marble, did not correct. The Mrs. Phoebe and Honoria said precisely nothing for 40 minutes apart from one observation upon the fineness of the day, which Lady Verity received as if it had been a treaty. At 3:20 the carriage was sent for. The chaise rattled away down the gravel sweep at 4:25. Lady Verity stood at the long window and watched it go. She turned. She looked at Imogen. Imogen looked back. There was a small, dreadful silence of perhaps 3 seconds, and then Lady Verity made, very softly, a single small sound that might have been a laugh, and Imogen, who had not laughed at Aldermere in 7 weeks, answered with one helpless, small choke of an answering laugh, and Lady Verity sank into the pale green sofa and laughed properly, and Imogen sat down on the other end and laughed with her. And Mrs. Doddington sent up a fresh pot of tea and a plate of seed cake without being rung for, and they laughed together over the seed cake for the better part of 1/4 of an hour. The first laugh Imogen had laughed under that roof, and the first Lady Verity had given herself leave for since her brother's wedding morning. Tuesday, the 24th came up warm and gold. Marlbrook Down stood high above a bright, summer-low, 7-tributary stream, a small green hill crowned with one great spreading oak, whose shadow fell long across the grass at noon. Sir Hubert had had the long picnic cloth laid under the oak by 10, and a striped marquee set up at the south end of the cloth, where the small string quartet from Worcester were tuning their fiddles in the warm air. 20 couples of the Worcestershire gentry came up the white lane from 11 onward. Imogen wore the high-waisted, pale primrose-yellow muslin morning gown with the short puff sleeves and the white lawn fichu, white silk gloves to the wrist, a plain straw bonnet trimmed with primrose-yellow ribbon, plain ivory silk slippers, and the silver locket on its black silk cord beneath the bodice. At her right ear, and at her right ear only, she wore a single small seed-pearl earring of her mother's. The other lay still in the small leather case upon her dressing-table. She had set the one in place that morning before her glass at 9:30, looking quietly at her own face, and had said in her mind only, "Mamma, today is one of mine. I have brought you the half of it." Tabitha, who had set her hair, had seen the single earring, and had pressed the back of Imogen's hand once with her thumb without a word. Alaric was beside her in dark green country coat, buff waistcoat, buff breeches, top boots, and his plain dark brown beaver hat in his hand. Sir Hubert came forward at the carriage step and handed Imogen down. Lady Marlbrook, in pale blue silk, kissed her on the cheek as if she had known her 30 years. "My dear," she said, "you are amongst friends today. I have set the gentry on the long side of the cloth, and the children at the short side near the marquee. And you are between Sir Theobald and the Reverend Tildesley. And after the cold chicken, you may go where you please." Imogen, who had not been arranged at any picnic since she was 16, found this practical kindness very nearly the finest thing she had heard at Aldermere, and said so, and was kissed again. She met Sir Theobald and Lady Drusilla Hayward-Brink, he tall and thin, she stout and red-cheeked, with a steady country humour, and the Reverend Ambrose Tildesley of Marlbrook Parish, thin, scholarly, gold-rimmed spectacles, a soft, slow voice, and Mr. Florian Oakley, a young squire of 26, who was charming in the way of young men who had been told all their lives they were charming. He bowed over her hand, and said he had been told that morning he was on no account to bore her. Imogen, with a small, steady smile, said, "Mr. Oakley, I should be obliged if you would tell me which of the children at the marquee end is Master Reginald, for I am told he is to be the chief authority upon the strawberries." Mr. Oakley laughed, pointed out a small dark-haired boy at the short end of the cloth, and was, on the spot, her firm friend. She met 5 tenant farmers' wives in turn, Mrs. Wilhelmina Carter, Mrs. Constance Brayton, Mrs. Frederica Yates, Mrs. Hester Wilkes, Mrs. Camilla Tyndall, each of whom dropped her a small, careful curtsy, and each of whom Imogen addressed by name within the minute, and asked one short, kind question of, after the manner Mrs. Doddington had taught her in the long galleries. By the second hour, she had stopped counting whom she had spoken to. She found, to her small private astonishment, that she had begun to enjoy herself. Master Reginald Marlbrook was 9 years old, dark-haired, freckled, in a small nankeen jacket, and entirely amazed by her. From the moment Imogen accepted a strawberry from his small, grubby, outstretched hand, he followed her at a respectful distance of 3 feet for the better part of an hour. He showed her the oak galls upon the great oak. He showed her a small green caterpillar he had found beneath the marquee. He asked her, with grave 9-year-old courtesy, whether the deer in the Aldermere Park had names, and Imogen said gravely that the chief stag was called Cromwell, which she had invented upon the spot, and which Master Reginald received as immutable truth. By 4, he had told her she was the finest lady he had ever met, and Imogen had thanked him with as much gravity as he had offered. She laughed quietly 5 times before tea. She did not count. Lady Verity, in the lavender silk, sat at the corner of the picnic cloth with a small leather-bound sketch-book in her lap, and now and again raised her eyes from the hedge-line she was drawing, and caught her brother's eye across the cloth, and her brother, who had not for 2 months and 22 days seen his wife laugh at all, looked back once and inclined his head, and Lady Verity returned to her hedge-line and said nothing of it for the rest of the afternoon. They drove back to Aldermere in the open landau at 5. The June light was gold along the Worcestershire lanes. The hawthorn was full out. The cuckoo called once from the home wood as they crossed the boundary of the park. Lady Verity sat upon the seat across from them, with her sketchbook open upon her knee, drawing with quiet intention the line of the hedge as the lane unwound. Her eyes did not lift from the page. Alaric sat beside Imogen on the long seat. He looked steadily ahead for half a mile. Then he turned his head. He spoke quietly, not above his ordinary voice, and Lady Verity did not lift her pencil from the paper. "Madam, you have been at Aldermere 2 months and 3 days. I observe today that you have, in spite of the warmest provocations from yourself, become my wife in the sense the marriage service intends. I should be obliged for your leave to address you, when we are alone, as Imogen." Imogen looked once at the gold lane ahead. Her gloved hands folded very still in her lap. The single seed-pearl earring caught the late light at her right ear. "Your Grace, you may," she said. "I shall, in return, address you as Alaric." He inclined his head. Lady Verity, without raising her eyes, drew one further line upon her hedge, and then, very quietly, she closed the sketch-book without comment, and set it upon the seat beside her, and put her gloved hands in her lap, and looked out at the gold lane all the way to the Aldermere gate. The kiss came one warm evening late in June. Lady Verity had retired at 10:30, Tabitha at 11. The candles in the library had burned low in their plain brass sticks. The long window above the south terrace stood open upon a still warm dark, and the smell of the night stock from the bed beneath the wall. Alaric had taken down from the rosewood box upon the library mantel one of his mother's letters, a thin folded sheet, the ink a little browned, dated July of 1791, and had given Imogen, that evening at supper, his quiet permission to read it. They sat together at the long writing-table by the window, the candle between them. He had unfolded the letter. He was reading it aloud at half-voice. She leaned over his shoulder to follow the line, and her warm, dark honey hair, loose at the temple from an hour at the harp, just brushed his jaw. He turned his head. He kissed her. Gently. Once, closed mouth, upright, the smallest small kiss a man may give a woman without any kind of advance. And he did not move after he had kissed her, and she did not draw back. She rested her cheek against his temple for the slow count of 3, and the candle stood between them, and somewhere out on the south terrace, a single moth flew at the open sash and away again. "Alaric," she said very quietly. It was the first time she had said his Christian name aloud in any private room. His voice, when he answered her, had gone rough. "Imogen, I have been very stupid for 78 days. 11 weeks, she said, is a short stupidity. I have heard of worse." He laughed once, a small private laugh, and bent his head, and kissed her once more upon the temple where her hair brushed his jaw, and folded his mother's letter back into its old creases. And they sat together at the long writing-table by the open window for a long quiet, while in the warm dark, and the candle burned down 1/4 inch. And that was all. July at Aldermere settled into a new kindness. He came up to her sitting room after dinner each night, and read to her for an hour. Cowper, then Wordsworth. And at the end of each hour, kissed her hand and said good night. He took her walking in the deer park at dawn, and she saw the fawns at the wood's edge for the first time in her life, and stood quite still in the wet grass for 5 minutes watching them. They rode together each morning, she upon Bryony and he upon his big bay gelding Quintus, along the long ride above the deer park. He set her down with him at the long table in the steward's office and showed her the form of the estate accounts. She had a clear head for figures, and by the 3rd week of July she had spotted in the proposed drainage scheme for the lower meadows a duplication in the timber cost that saved Mr. Bartlett £40. That evening, in the housekeeper's room over a cup of tea, he said quietly in his soft burr, "Mrs. Doddington, Her Grace has a very nice hand for a ledger." Mrs. Doddington said only, "Mr. Bartlett, I had observed it," and reached for the seed cake. The letter from London came up in the mid-July post on a still hot afternoon. Tabitha brought it to the blue chamber upon the small silver salver, the seal an unfamiliar one, the hand of a London man of business. Imogen broke the seal at her writing desk. She read the letter once. She read it a second time, more slowly. Mr. Roderick Crouch, having spent the £200 he had managed to extract from his late stepfather's dwindled estate, applied through the present writer to his Grace's solicitor for a private acknowledgment of services rendered in the modest sum of £8,000. Imogen sat very still at her writing desk for 1 full minute. She did not put the letter in the fire. She rang the bell. Tabitha came up. "Tabby," she said, in the same clear, soft contralto she had given to Sir Hubert in the pale green saloon. "Be so good as to take this to his Grace in his study. Add to it, with my compliments, that I desire to be present when his Grace replies." Tabitha took the letter and went down the back stair without a word. Imogen closed her desk. She rose. She crossed to the long sash that gave upon the south terrace and stood for a moment looking out at the late July roses on the south wall. Then she turned. She set out upon her writing desk a single sheet of plain cream paper, sharpened a fresh quill, and dipped it in the small stand of clear black ink. She wrote, in her clear, even hand, a single sentence to be sent only after Alaric had decided whether Mr. Crouch should be received at all. "Sir, your letter of the 15th has been received and shall be answered in the proper season." She blotted it once with the silver-handled blotter. She left it upon the desk for Alaric's signature. She picked up her sewing, a small fine piece of white cambric, the first 3 inches of a hem in tiny, even white stitches, and she sat down in the south window in the soft, sea-green silk morning gown she had chosen that day because it was one of her own colours, and she sewed on through the warm noon with a clear, quiet face, and the bell of the home farm struck the half-hour somewhere across the park, and the fawns lay folded in the bracken at the wood's edge, and the late roses opened their pale pinks and their creams along the south wall of Aldermere Priory, and the long campaign that had begun in a worn Shropshire drawing-room in April was, in its quiet way, very nearly won. The first week of August came warm and still over the Worcestershire hills, the cut hay stacked in long pale gold ricks in the home farm meadows, the chestnut leaves at the gate of the avenue showing only the smallest hint that the year had turned past its high noon. On the 28th of July, Alaric had written an express to Mr. Crispin Brown in Lincoln's Inn, and on the 3rd of August the post-chaise from London turned in at the great gate of Aldermere Priory at 4:30 in the afternoon, and set Mr. Brown and his leather portfolio down at the south steps in a soft drift of late summer dust. He came up to the library that evening in his plain black superfine tailcoat and his gold-rimmed spectacles, and laid out upon the long writing table the folder of Sterne House accounts that his London agent had been quietly building since the last week of April: rent rolls, household ledgers, the dealer receipts from 3 Shropshire towns, the sworn affidavit of Mrs. Tabitha Wainwright, taken before a magistrate at Shrewsbury on the 21st of July. He answered Alaric's questions for an hour, and took his supper on a tray in his chamber at 9. The morning of the 4th was given over to the papers. Alaric and Mr. Brown went through the Sterne House income year by year, from the autumn of 1814, item by item, page by page, and Mr. Brown marked the relevant entries with small folded slips of cream paper. The Reverend Cyril Hollington, sent for from Shropshire as a witness to whatever should pass on the morning of the 5th, came over by the morning stage. The Aldermere brougham brought him up to the Priory by 12. He sat for an hour after dinner with Imogen in the small green saloon, and asked her, kindly, only one question about her mother, which she answered in her clear, soft contralto, and they did not speak of Mr. Roderick Crouch at all that evening. The library at Aldermere had been arranged in the manner of a paper interview. The long writing table was set across the middle of the room. Alaric was to sit at it. A small rosewood table had been carried in from the late Duchess's apartments and set by the leaded window that gave upon the rose garden. Imogen was to sit there. A plain chair, centrally placed, had been set for Lady Verity. A side table had been set against the eastern wall for Mr. Brown and his ledger. with a further chair beside it for Reverend Hollington as witness. There were no weapons in the room. There was no decanter. At 11:15 on Tuesday the 5th of August, Imogen came down the great staircase in her plain dark blue morning gown with the long sleeves and the high round neck, the white lawn fichu folded composedly at her throat, the silver locket on its black silk cord against the dark wool, her dark honey hair smooth in the low chignon at the nape, her hands ungloved. Lady Verity in lavender silk, half-mourning, was already at her chair in the centre of the room, her sewing frame upon her knee. Reverend Hollington, in his black clerical coat and white collar band, and the small silver crucifix on the black silk cord, stood at the side table beside Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown was seated, his leather-bound ledger open before him, his folder laid square at his right hand. Alaric, in the dark blue superfine morning coat and the white cravat properly tied, and the dove-grey silk waistcoat and the charcoal pantaloons and the polished black Hessian boots, the heavy silver Aldermere signet upon his right hand, rose from the long writing table as Imogen came in. He waited until she was seated at the rosewood table with her hands folded in her lap. The clock upon the mantel struck 11. Mr. Crouch was admitted by Mr. Bartlett with a face perfectly impassive. He came in with oily ceremony, the dark claret tailcoat with its worn gilt buttons over the slightly stained primrose-yellow silk waistcoat, the buff pantaloons creased from the post-chaise, the top boots with brass tassels 2 seasons unpolished, the quizzing-glass on its black ribbons swinging at his chest, the 3 carnelian seals with the chipped enamel jingling at his watch-chain. He bowed with a half-smile to Alaric, less low to Lady Verity, and to Imogen with the barest inclination of his thinning sandy-brown Brutus. He did not look at Mr. Brown or at Reverend Hollington at all. He took the chair set for him opposite Alaric, and laid his leather portfolio upon the table. He spoke for nearly 40 minutes. He spoke of injured dignity, and of a guardian's burden, and of the long, thankless labour of a stepson never properly thanked, touching the corner of his portfolio with one finger from time to time. At length he drew its contents out and laid it upon the table, an itemised guardian's account, in his own hand, on 3 pages of cheap foolscap, totalling for the years of the Crouch occupation of Sterne House the sum of £8,000, clothing, food, education, the maintenance of the family seat, the negotiations of the present marriage, the discharge of certain late debts. He laid down the foolscap, folded his hands, and waited. Alaric did not speak. He looked at Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, who had not risen, opened the leather-bound ledger at the slip of cream paper marked Clothing, and adjusted his spectacles 1/4 of an inch upon his nose. "Mr. Crouch," said Mr. Brown in his dry, steady, scholarly manner, "I shall address each item of your account in order. The first head is Clothing. The household allowance ledger of Sterne House, kept in the hand of Mrs. Tabitha Wainwright since the autumn of 1814, shows Miss Sterne received £4 in 1815 for her dress, 3 in 1816, and nothing in 1817. The grey wool gown in which she stood at the altar of St. Chad's on the 13th of April was made up by Mrs. Wainwright from a length of her own keeping in 3 days. Mrs. Wainwright was sworn to the matter before a magistrate at Shrewsbury on the 21st of July. The deposition is at my hand." He turned a page. "The second head is food. Sterne House has had, even in its diminished state, an annual income of £600. The household kept a single milking cow, 2 pigs, and a kitchen garden, the whole under Mrs. Wainwright's management. Miss Sterne ate, by her stepmother's arrangement, at the kitchen table with the cook. The cost of her board over 3 years cannot exceed £30. He turned a page. "The third head is education. Miss Sterne's education was completed in the autumn of 1813 under the supervision of her late father. The Crouch household has provided no governess since October 1814, no tutor, no master of any kind. The expense at this head is nothing. He turned a page. The fourth head is the maintenance of the family seat. Upon this head, the entail conditions of the late Mr. Sterne's settlement of 1813 are explicit. The chattels of Sterne House are not yours to dispose of. Mr. Bartlett's London agent and a Mr. Henshaw of Shrewsbury have traced the following sales from the Sterne House contents between October 1814 and June 1817. 12 silver salvers, sold at Ludlow. 1 Stradivari violin, known to have been Lady Lavinia Sterne's, sold to a London dealer. 4 hunters from the home stables, the Sterne library of some 800 volumes, the hall mirrors, the linen press contents. The receipts and the dealer affidavits are at my hand. The sums received by you upon these breaches of the entail come, in aggregate, to upwards of £4,200. Her Grace the Duchess of Aldermere is, by way of restitution, owed by you the said sum. The chipped enamel seal at Roderick's watch chain ticked once, twice, against the gilt buttons of his waistcoat as he drew breath. Mr. Brown turned a page. The fifth head is the negotiations of the present marriage. I have your letter of February to His Grace's London man, in your own hand, upon the table at my left. He read it, verbatim, in the same dry voice, from the offer of Miss Sterne's hand to the figure of the £15,000 to be paid privately upon the wedding morning. He set the letter down. I shall observe, Mr. Crouch, that the offer of a young woman's hand for cash payment to her step-relative is, in any English court, an action that would not stand the daylight of an hour's hearing. The £15,000 was not paid. There is no debt at this head. He turned a page. The sixth head is the discharge of certain late debts. I have made every reasonable inquiry of the late Mr. Sterne's tradesmen in Aston-upon-Wenlock, Shrewsbury, Ludlow, and Hereford. I have been unable to identify a single debt of Mr. Sterne's left unpaid at his death, which you have discharged from your own pocket. I have, on the contrary, identified 3 small debts of your own, to a Birmingham tailor, a Worcester wine merchant, and a London hatter, which have been paid out of the Sterne household income in 1815 and 1816, the entries of which are in your own ledger at the dates I have marked. Mr. Brown folded his hands upon his ledger. He said nothing more. The library was very quiet. The leaded panes by Imogen's elbow let in a soft, warm, late-morning light upon the white lawn at her throat. Lady Verity drew her needle through the lavender silk, without raising her eyes. Imogen's hands lay folded in her lap. They had not moved. Alaric set down his pen. He looked across the long writing table at Mr. Roderick Crouch. "Sir," he said, in his deep, clear, unhurried baritone, with the small, dry warmth quite gone from it. "My wife is not here today as Miss Sterne, and I am not here as the man who paid you £15,000 in April to be permitted to marry her. I paid you nothing in April, and I shall pay you nothing in August. You have, for 16 years, treated my wife as the inconvenient leftover of 2 estates that were never yours. You will leave this house at 12. You will not write to her again in any year. Should you write to her, her letters will not reach her hand. They will reach Mr. Brown's. Should you appear at Aldermere again, you will be removed by my steward and the second footman, and the matter will be laid before the magistrates. We are agreed." Mr. Crouch wet his thin upper lip. The half-smile of self-satisfaction was still upon his face, but it was a poor, thin thing now, and it did not reach the small, shallow, squinting brown eyes. He drew the quizzing-glass up between 2 fingers and let it fall again. "Your Grace," he said, in a tone meant for civility. "Before we conclude, there is one further matter, of which Mr. Brown can have no knowledge. An old debt, Your Grace, of your father's, owed to mine in 1799, which I have kept among my private papers these 18 years. He laid his hand upon the leather portfolio. Mr. Brown, without rising, opened a small folder he had set upon the side table from the first. Mr. Crouch, the said debt does not exist. Your father had been declared bankrupt at the Court of King's Bench on the 11th of November 1798. Your father owed at his death, on the contrary, the sum of £312 to the late Mr. Charles Sterne, which Mr. Sterne quietly forgave, in the autumn of 1810, for Mrs. Petronella Crouch's sake. The forgiveness is endorsed in Mr. Sterne's own hand on the back of the bond, which is in my folder, and which I shall be happy to lay before you, should you require it. Mr. Crouch's hand stopped upon the leather portfolio. He went, slowly and quite distinctly, white about the mouth. The small chipped enamel seal at his watch chain trembled once. He withdrew his hand. I withdraw the application, he said. You will withdraw it in writing, Mr. Crouch, said Mr. Brown, before you leave this room. A clean sheet of cream paper was set before him. A pen was dipped and laid in his hand. He wrote the 4 lines, Mr. Brown dictated and signed his name. Mr. Brown blotted the sheet and closed it inside the ledger. The leather portfolio was set into Roderick's hands by Mr. Brown, and the second footman, who had stood at the library door these 40 minutes, opened it for him. The clock upon the mantel struck 12 as Mr. Crouch crossed the threshold. He did not turn his head. The wheels of the post-chaise sounded upon the south sweep within 5 minutes, and diminished along the avenue, and were gone. The library settled. Reverend Hollington took his small gold-rimmed spectacles off his nose and polished them upon a fold of his white collar band and set them back. I have had the privilege, Your Grace, he said dryly, of seeing one piece of the Lord's quiet work concluded this morning. Lady Verity laughed once, briefly into her sewing, and said nothing. Mr. Brown gathered his papers in his neat scholar's hand and laid the folder square at the centre of the side table. Alaric rose from the long writing table. He crossed the room without haste to the leaded window, where Imogen sat at her small rosewood table. He did not kiss her. He took her ungloved hand in his, and held it for half a minute in a clasp, neither tight nor loose, and the light through the leaded panes lay upon the silver locket at her throat, and upon the wedding ring upon her finger. Imogen, he said, very low. I should have done this the morning after we married you, and I did not, and I am sorry. He shall not trouble you again. She lifted her clear sea-green eyes to his. She did not weep. The long composed mouth softened only by a little. Alaric, she said, he troubled me yesterday, and he shall not trouble me tomorrow. That is the most I have asked of any morning since my mother died. Thank you. The rest of August at Aldermere kept warm and gold. The cut hay went up into the great barns. The late roses on the south wall opened in pale pinks and creams. The deer in the park lay in the long shade beneath the chestnuts at noon. From the 3rd week of August, Imogen began to wear both of her mother's seed-pearl earrings every evening at dinner. The pair Mr. Brown had recovered in late April, and which she had kept until the morning Mr. Crouch left Aldermere in their leather case upon her dressing-table. They sat very small and fine at her ears beneath the dark honey hair, and Lady Verity, who had come down to dinner the first night Imogen wore them and seen them, and said nothing, sent up a small private note to her sister-in-law's chamber at midnight, which read only, "My dear, they are exactly right. Mamma would be glad. V." In the 2nd week of August, Lady Verity wrote to Bath, and Madame Larocque's daughter, now a mantua-maker in her own right above a milliner's in the Pump-Room Arcade, sent up by the next post a packet of silk samples and a fine line drawing of a high-waisted gown with short puff sleeves and a row of small antique seed pearls along the hem. Imogen chose the deepest of the 3 claret silks. The first fitting was set for the 4th week of September. The gown was for the Michaelmas birthday dinner in October, and it was a private business. A still warm August evening, the candles lit early against the first faint thickening of the late summer dusk. Imogen and Alaric were at breakfast in the small green dining room, only the two of them. Lady Verity had gone up to the long gallery to write letters. Imogen set down her cup. She folded her hands upon the linen at the edge of her plate. She said in the same clear, soft contralto with which she had once given a small, precise, public smile at the altar of St. Chad's, "Alaric, I had thought that I ought to tell you before any other person in the house has occasion to remark upon it. I am, by Mrs. Doddington's reckoning and by my own, carrying a child. The child is due, by my count, in the first half of May." Alaric set down his knife with a small, clean click upon the edge of his plate. He stood. He crossed to her chair without haste. He went down upon one knee, beside it in the dark, walnut-brown morning coat he had put on for the home farm, and he took her ungloved hand in both of his, and he kissed it once upon the back, where the silver wedding ring caught the morning light through the south sash. "Madam," he said in a voice gone a little rough, "Imogen, I did not dare hope so soon." She laid her free hand a moment upon the dark walnut hair at his temple and let it rest there. She did not weep. She said softly, "We are very fortunate, Alaric. I had not dared hope it either." And he held her hand a long moment more, and rose, and drew up his chair beside hers, rather than across the table, and they finished their breakfast, side by side, in a quiet that did not require speech. Tabitha was the second to know, that same morning in the small north sitting-room, with the door closed, and she pressed Imogen's hand and turned her face to the window for a full half-minute, and would not let Imogen see her cry. Lady Verity was the third, that evening before dinner, and laughed once and said only, "Of course you are, my dear. It is how these things are properly done," and kissed Imogen on both cheeks for the first time since April. Mrs. Doddington had guessed the week before from the small details of Imogen's tray, and had said nothing to any soul living. In the 4th week of August, on a warm, still evening with the leaded windows of the library standing open upon the rose garden, Alaric drew a folded paper from the small drawer of the long writing table. It was the clause Mr. Brown had insisted upon in March, a separate residence and a continued income, granted to Imogen at her own free choice in the event that the marriage should at any time within its first 5 years prove insupportable to her. Alaric held the page up to the candlelight and looked at it for a long moment. "Imogen," he said, "I shall not need this." She had risen from her own small writing table at the south end of the library, and come quietly to stand beside him in the soft sea-green silk of the evening gown, the silver locket at her throat, the seed pearls at her ears. She looked at the page. She looked at his face. She said very quietly, "No, you shall not." He tore the page across, and across again, and laid the 4 pieces upon the small bright fire that had been lit against the first thin coolness of the late evening, and the corners curled and blackened and went up. They sat a long time afterwards in the 2 chairs by the library fire, her hand upon the arm of his chair, and his upon the arm of hers, and the clock upon the mantel ticked, and the red light of the fire moved slowly along the gilt of the books on the lower shelves. The last evening of August, the candles burning low in the brass sticks upon the library mantel, the leaded windows standing open upon a still warm late dusk, the first faintest tinge of autumn in the air. Imogen sat in the south window in the soft sea-green silk gown with the silver locket at her throat and the seed pearls at her ears, mending one-handed upon a small square of plain white lawn. The white lawn was the first 3 inches of hem of a christening cloth. Her stitches were tiny and even and white as snow. Alaric sat at the long writing table with a letter open before him, the the dark walnut-brown hair falling in its one lock across the brow. The letter was from Sir Hubert Marlbrook, thanking them with much warmth for the day at Marlbrook Down in June, and mentioning in a postscript that his 9-year-old grandson had asked particularly to be remembered to the Duchess. Alaric read it aloud in his deep, unhurried baritone, the postscript twice, with the small dry warmth that surfaced only in private rooms. Imogen looked up once from her hem. She met Alaric's grey-blue eyes. She lowered her gaze again to the small, even stitches. The candles burned low. The first faint tinge of autumn moved through the leaded window upon the warm, late August air. The rose garden stood quiet under the early stars. And the long campaign that had begun in a worn Shropshire drawing-room in April was now, at the end of August, a thing very nearly settled, and a small christening cloth of plain white lawn lay in the lap of a Duchess of 22 who had, for the first morning in 16 years, asked of the world only that it should not trouble her tomorrow. The first week of September came in soft and cool to Aldermere, with the long avenue of chestnuts beginning to show the first thin gilding at their crowns, and the late roses upon the south wall carrying their last warm blossom into the autumn light. Imogen rose each morning at 7:30 in the fawn-grey wool morning gown with the silver locket at her throat, and went up the back stair to the Duchess's apartments before breakfast. Mrs. Doddington had hung Lavinia's recovered miniature there in the 3rd week of August, beside the small private one of Lady Octavia, which had been kept in the same room since 1815. Imogen had decided that she would not put her father's miniature in any room where his memory would be uncomfortable. Charles Sterne sat instead upon her writing desk in the morning room, in a small ebony frame, with a single sprig of rosemary changed each Monday. Lavinia and Octavia, however, sat together in the upstairs sitting-room, and Imogen visited them each morning, stood for a quiet half-minute, and went down again. There was, that early September, a gentle softening at her waist that no eye but Tabitha's would have remarked upon, and a small even quiet about her at the breakfast table that Alaric had begun to recognise as the new shape of the household. He came to breakfast each morning at 8 in the dark green country coat with the buff waistcoat, read his letters at the end of the table, and looked up once or twice across the cloth at his wife with the small dry warmth in the corner of his grave, grey-blue eyes. The household settled itself, by quiet degrees, into the gold latter half of the year. On the morning of the 14th of September, Imogen took Tabitha up into the Aldermere carriage at 8:30 in the gravel sweep, with Mr. Bartlett at the head of the lead horse to see them off, and they went down the long avenue of chestnuts toward Bath. Tabitha sat opposite her in the clean black bombazine and the small starched white linen cap, her bony hands folded upon a grey wool shawl across her knee, her warm, faded, pale blue eyes turned upon the passing hedge line with the careful composure of a woman who had not been beyond Worcestershire in 15 years. 3 mornings before, Imogen had told her in the small north sitting-room that they were going to Bath for 3 nights. Tabitha had set down her work-basket and said very quietly, "Madam, I have not been to Bath since the summer of 1796. Imogen had taken her hand and said only, "I know, Tabby, we are going together this time." They came into Bath on the late afternoon of the 14th, and were met at Royal Crescent by Mrs. Pusey, who had aired the pale blue front parlour and made up the 2 best bedchambers. Tabitha stood a long moment in the marble-floored hall and looked along the curve of the staircase as one looks at a place one has not seen since one was very young. She said nothing. She folded her grey shawl and went up behind the footman. The 15th was given to small private errands. Imogen went with Tabitha at 11 to the chemist upon Milsom Street and bought a parcel of orange flower water in a small white earthenware bottle stopped with cork. Tabitha looked at the bottle and said quietly, Madame, your mother was very fond of the orange flower water from this very shop. Imogen paid and placed the parcel in her reticule. She said on the pavement outside, "Tabby, we shall give a little to Mrs. Petronella tomorrow, with a folded note from you." In the early afternoon they walked along Pulteney Street. Tabitha stopped at the door of a small narrow house with a fresh white step, laid her thin bony hand upon the iron railing, and said in a voice no louder than the autumn wind in the area grating, "Madame, she made your mother's veil in this house in the spring of 1796, and your grandmother by affection set 10 years before that, and she died in 1812, and I did not know it until this minute. She wept briefly into a linen handkerchief, for not above 20 seconds. Imogen put her arm beneath Tabitha's elbow. They walked on. Madame Larocque's daughter had set up at Milsom Street, in 2 small rooms above a milliner's, with the lace stretched upon a long narrow frame in the front window. She was 44, soft-spoken, in plain dark grey poplin. Imogen brought her the deep claret silk and a packet of antique seed pearls Mr. Brown had sent down from London in August, and Mademoiselle Larocque fitted the gown upon her at 3 o'clock on the 16th. Imogen had given her name as Mrs. Mountford of Worcestershire. She remarked only, with a careful French inflection, that the lady's waist was very gently softened, and that she would set the hem allowance generously for the spring. Before she left, Imogen wrote out an instruction to Mr. Brown to settle a private annuity of £40 a year upon Mademoiselle Larocque, to be paid quarterly so long as she should live, in token of the work her mother had done in 1786 and 1796, and to be communicated to her only as the gift of a Worcestershire benefactor who knew your mother's work. Mademoiselle Larocque, who never knew the name of her benefactor, learned of the annuity by Mr. Brown's letter upon the 1st of October, and she stood at her work frame with the letter in her hand, and laid her cheek against the fine French lace, and wept once for her mother. The 17th was given to Mrs. Petronella Crouch. She lived now in a small first-floor lodging off Henrietta Street, 2 narrow rooms with a small grate, kept by a respectable widow at £1 a week. Mrs. Petronella had lost weight. The faded plum bombazine hung loose at her shoulders. Her watery, pale blue eyes were very tired. She had not seen Roderick since June. Tabitha did not stay. She left after a minute, and Imogen sat with her stepmother for 40 minutes at the small grate. They spoke of Charles Sterne, for almost the first time since 1814. Mrs. Petronella, who, in 5 years of marriage, had loved him better than any person had ever credited her with having loved any human creature, told 3 small, affectionate stories of his courtship in 1809. She wept quietly into a folded lawn handkerchief. Imogen sat beside her, neither pressing nor withdrawing, and said only at the end of the 40 minutes, "Madame, I had not known. I am very glad to know it now." She rose. She set upon the small table the parcel of orange flower water and a folded note from Tabitha. At the door, she kissed her once on the cheek and said, "We shall hope to see you at Aldermere upon the 28th of October, ma'am." Mrs. Petronella inclined her thin head. "Madam, I shall come." They were back at Aldermere by the late afternoon of the 19th, and Imogen wrote one letter that evening. To Lady Marlbrook, accepting the invitation to dine on the 6th of October. In the last week of September, a letter came from Reverend Cyril Hollington in Shropshire, confirming that he would come over for Lady Octavia's birthday dinner upon the 28th, Tuesday, the 28th of October, 1817, came in a warm gold Worcestershire morning of the kind that the county sometimes gives back to itself in the last fortnight of autumn. The long avenue of chestnuts was at full turn, gold and copper, and the late roses upon the south wall carried their last warm blossom. After breakfast, Imogen cut a single white camellia she had grown in the south-facing glass house since June, and laid it upon the deep claret silk gown which Mademoiselle Larocque had sent up from Bath in a long wooden box upon the 22nd. The dinner was set for 6:30. 24 were expected. The dining-room was laid by 10. The heavy Mountford silver-gilt candelabra were set down the centre of the long table by 11:30. The beeswax candles were trimmed for the 6 footmen in the Aldermere livery by 3. Above the long sideboard hung the single large portrait of Lady Octavia Mountford, which Lawrence had painted in 1798, when she was 30, in white muslin with a single rose. Imogen stood once before it at noon in the soft fawn-grey wool morning gown, inclined her head 1/4 inch, and went up the back stair to dress. Tabitha dressed her at 5:30 in the Duchess's apartments. The deep claret silk went on first, the antique seed pearls catching the candlelight along the embroidered hem. The silver locket was settled at her throat. Her mother's seed pearl earrings were fastened by Tabitha's careful old fingers, and at the last, from the silver-lined chest at the foot of the writing-desk, Tabitha drew the matching ivory blonde lace gloves of 1786 from their folded white tissue, and drew them up Imogen's slender forearms to above the elbow. Imogen stood very still, while Tabitha pinned the single white camellia at her shoulder, then turned to the long looking-glass and stood for one quiet half-minute, and Tabitha, who had stitched at the corner of the very veil which had brought this evening to pass, laid her thin bony hand once upon the deep claret silk at Imogen's elbow, and did not speak. Alaric was in the library at 6 in the black, superfine evening tailcoat, the white starched cravat, the white silk waistcoat with the very faint dove-grey pinstripe, the black satin knee breeches, the white silk stockings, and the buckled black evening shoes. The Aldermere ducal signet was upon his right hand. Upon the smallest finger of his left hand he wore, that one evening in the year, his late mother's small mourning ring, a thin gold band with a single jetstone, which he had taken out of the rosewood box upon the library mantel an hour before. He stood at the foot of the grand staircase, as Imogen came down in the deep claret silk and the lace gloves of 1786, and took her hand in his, and held it for the length of 3 quiet breaths. He said only, in the deep baritone gone a little quieter than usual, "Imogen." She said only, "Alaric." Then they went together into the long gallery to receive their guests. The carriages came in between 6:30 and 7:15. Lady Verity came down in lavender silk, half-mourning, and stood at Imogen's left hand. Mr. Crispin Brown came up from London in plain black superfine. Reverend Hollington came over from Shropshire in his black clerical coat, his gold-rimmed spectacles misted from the cold of the Birmingham stage. Mr. Augustus Bartlett came up from the steward's house in his Sunday best and was put at his customary place at the lower end. Sir Hubert and Lady Marlbrook arrived, Sir Theobald and Lady Drusilla, Heywood Brink after them. The local gentry, 10 couples in all, settled into the long gallery. Tabitha Wainwright, in her best black bombazine with the small jet brooch, was led to her place upon Sir Hubert's left by Imogen herself. Mrs. Petronella Crouch had come up from the Marlbrook Arms in plain black silk and a small lace cap, and was settled between Lady Marlbrook and Lady Drusilla. Roderick was not there. At 6:30, the doors of the dining-room were opened by the senior footman, and the company went in. The long table was laid for 24 upon white damask, with the heavy Mountford silver-gilt candelabra down the centre, and the beeswax candles burning steady, and Lady Octavia, in her painted white muslin, and the single rose, looked down from above the long sideboard upon her own birthday table. Reverend Hollington stood at his place, near the head, and laid his thin hands upon the back of his chair, and the company laid down their napkins, and the late October light at the leaded windows turned from warm gold to the first thin blue of dusk. Father of all mercies, Reverend Hollington said, in his clear, quiet scholar's voice, "We thank thee for this bread. this wine, this fire, this roof, and these good friends. We thank thee particularly for the two old friends, Octavia Mountford and Lavinia Sterne, who did not live to see this evening, but who are at this table all the same, and for the keeping of two old promises made in 1815 upon a Worcestershire deathbed, and in 1796 in a Shropshire bridal veil. We commend the Duke and Duchess of Aldermere, and the child who is to come to thy keeping, and we send ourselves to our meat with thankful hearts. Amen. No one looked at any person in particular while he spoke. The beeswax candles burned steady. Tabitha sat at Sir Hubert's elbow, with her white head bowed beneath the clean starched cap. Mrs. Petronella sat between Lady Marlbrook and Lady Drusilla, and wept quietly into her plain-folded lawn handkerchief. Lady Verity sat at the foot of the table, with her hands folded upon the white damask. Lady Octavia, in her painted silence, looked down from above the sideboard upon them all. And across the length of the shining table, Imogen met Alaric's pale grey-blue eyes, once for one long, steady second, and beneath the table he found her hand in the lace glove of 1786, and held it for the length of 3 quiet breaths before he let her go. The dinner began. Sir Hubert Marlbrook, ruddy and easy in the dark green country coat, leaned a little toward the small, upright old woman at his elbow, and told Tabitha, who had been seated next to him by Imogen's own placement card, 3 small, affectionate stories of Imogen's grandfather, Lord Ashby, with whom Sir Hubert had hunted over the Welsh borders country in the autumn of 1791. A small bay mare Lord Ashby had ridden that season. A wager of 6 shillings settled upon the Lich Gate of Aston upon Wenlock, a stirrup cup taken at 4 o'clock of a frosty November afternoon at the Ashby Arms. Tabitha laughed once, soft and astonished, and then again, and then a third time, the small clear laugh of a Worcestershire borders girl who had not laughed in 15 years, and Mrs. Doddington at the door saw Tabitha laugh, and turned her own face for a moment toward the long gallery, and pressed her lips together and did not speak. Lady Verity, at the foot of the table, was at her formidable best, conducting Sir Theobald Hayward Brink through her views upon the new Corn Laws, with the patient courtesy of a woman who had once made her late husband listen to the same argument for 2 hours upon a journey from Lincoln to Bath. Mr. Crispin Brown, beside Lady Marlbrook, told her quietly across his soup that the law was a slower trade than people supposed. Mr. Augustus Bartlett, in his soft Worcestershire burr, confided across the centre of the table to Mrs. Doddington at the side that her Grace had a very nice hand for a ledger, and would, God willing, be the making of the Lower Meadows by Lady Day. The candles burned down. The October light at the leaded windows went blue, then deep velvet dark. The ladies withdrew at 10. The gentlemen joined them at 11:15. Mrs. Petronella, who had borne the evening with quiet courage and was very tired, asked Imogen at 10:30 whether she might retire to the Marlbrook Arms. Tabitha climbed up beside her in the hired chaise to see her settled. Imogen kissed Mrs. Petronella once on the cheek and said only, "Madame, sleep well." The last carriage rolled away at midnight. The great front doors were drawn to, and Aldermere settled into the velvet quiet of late October. Alaric had changed, by 12:30, out of the black evening tailcoat into a plain dark green country coat with the buff waistcoat, the white cravat unstarched, the buckled shoes exchanged for soft house slippers. Imogen was still in the deep claret silk and the ivory blonde lace gloves of 1786. She had taken off only the single white camellia at her shoulder and laid it in a small saucer of clear water upon the library mantel. They sat down together by the library fire, which had been built up for them by the senior footman before he was sent to bed. The small clock upon the mantel said 1 minute past 1, when Alaric drew, from the small rosewood box upon the same mantel, the the folded letter that his late mother had written to him in the last week of her life in November of 1815, and unfolded it upon his knee in the leather wing chair on the right of the fire. He read it aloud in the deep, clear baritone, gone very quiet now. Octavia's instruction concerning Lavinia's child, which he had carried for 14 months of searching, her affectionate words upon her son's grave manner, and her hope that he should not become a colder man than she had borne. Her direction that he should plant a single white rose upon her grave in May of 1816, and another in May of 1817, her closing line, written in a hand by then very weak. "Alaric, my dear son, I have loved you very well, and I require of you only that you should keep my one important promise, and that you should learn, if it should please God, to love the keeping of it, as much as the promise itself." Imogen mended, one-handed, the first 3 inches of hem upon the small christening cloth she had begun at the end of August. Her stitches were tiny and even and white as snow. She did not look up while he read. The firelight caught her dark honey hair along the line of her temple. The silver locket at her throat moved gently with her quiet breath. The lace of 1786 at her wrists folded composedly over the deep claret silk in her lap. Alaric finished the letter. He folded it, the same fold his mother had folded it in. He set it aside upon the small table at his elbow. He looked up at his wife in the chair on the left of the fire. "Imogen Charlotte Sterne Mountford, Duchess of Aldermere," he said, in the deep, clear baritone of a man who had practised the words once in the privacy of his own room, and was, even now, taking some small care with them. "My dear wife, I came to Shropshire in April upon my mother's last wish. I leave this autumn evening upon your own. I have, in 6.5 months, learned to be the man my mother said I should be obliged to become if I were to deserve the keeping of her one important promise. I am in your debt for the life I did not deserve and was given all the same, one cold, pale blue April afternoon at the Lich Gate of St. Chad's." Imogen set her mending down upon her knee. The lace of her grandmother by affection's gloves caught the firelight at her wrists. She lifted her clear sea-green eyes once to his pale grey-blue ones across the small distance of the hearth-rug. "Alaric," she said, "I shall not answer that this evening. I shall answer it every morning for a great many years." He inclined his dark walnut head 1/4 of an inch. He did not speak. He did not move from his chair to hers, nor she from hers to his. They sat a long time afterwards in the firelight without speaking. The small clock upon the library mantel struck 1, and then the half, and then 2, and the fire burned lower in the grate, and the deep velvet dark of the late October night moved quietly along the leaded windows of the library, and was not disturbed by any sound from the long sleeping house above them. There are mistaken identity stories that begin in a ballroom. There are stories that begin at a christening register. And there are rarer, slower stories that begin with a cold sentence in a worn Shropshire drawing-room on a Tuesday morning in April, and end, 6.5 months later, with a quiet, plain grace at a Worcestershire dinner-table for 2 old friends who did not live to see the evening. Octavia Mountford gave Lavinia Ashby a wedding veil in June of 1796, and stitched at the corner her own initials beside her friend's, and the date in tiny silver thread, no thicker than a hair. Lavinia died in 1801. Octavia died in 1815. The veil lay folded in cedar shavings at the bottom of an oak trunk in a small Shropshire manor for 16 years, and only one old nurse in a clean white linen cap knew it was there. And in April of 1817, on a cold, pale blue Welsh borders morning, a 7th Duke of Aldermere lifted that veil at the altar of St. Chad's Parish Church, and saw, in tiny silver thread at the corner of the lace, what no other eye in the church could see: that his mother, 2 years dead, had given his bride's mother, 16 years dead, the very veil her daughter now wore on the day she was wed, in token of a friendship neither he nor she had been told of. And so, on a warm gold Worcestershire evening of the 28th of October, 1817, the woman who had once been told to wear a veil because nothing else of her mother's was left wore the matching gloves of her mother's oldest friend, and the two old promises made in 2 old wedding years met under the candlelight at one Aldermere table, and the long 16-year quiet of 2 unkept memories was at last ended.